you are coming into the Hyde Park Book Club, jointly sponsored by Chicago Hyde Park Historical Society and Chicago Hyde Park Village. And you have our information here at the bottom of the screen. Welcome, everyone, and we hope you enjoy the program tonight. It's going to be, I think, interesting and like.
That's it. She wrote that. He read that.
Okay.
All right, it's just a little after 7:30. I think we should start the meeting now. I would like to welcome our guest, Deborah Cohen, author of Last Call at the Hotel Imperial. And welcome to the Hyde Park Book Club, sponsored by Chicago Hyde Park Village and the Hyde Park Historical Society. I'm going to turn the meeting over now to Dottie Jeffries, who will introduce our author and conduct a conversation. And I will be letting other people in as we go along. And Deborah, let me know when you want, or you can share your screen at any point. So Dottie, it's over to you.
Okay. So I'm pleased to introduce Deborah Cohen and welcome her to the Hyde Park Book Club this evening. Deborah is the Richard W. Leopold Professor of History and Chair of the History Department at Northwestern University. She writes regularly for The Atlantic on subjects ranging from punk rock to World War I photographs. Her essay about Anglo-Argentine families was published in Past and Present, and she wrote about consumerism and mega factories in the New York Review of Books. Among her other books is The War Come Home, Disabled Veterans in Britain and Germany, 1914 to 1939. Deborah was raised in Louisville, Kentucky, and is a resident of Chicago. So welcome, Deborah, and I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really great to be here. So what I'm going to do is to go ahead and share my screen. And I'm just going to make sure that this is actually sharing in the way that I want it to share. Okay. I was saying that one of the kind of happy and pleasant things is that these days, this is quite as automatic as it used to be. So is it now full screen for you?
No.
Okay.
Well, we're seeing the PowerPoint menu.
You're just getting the PowerPoint menu. Okay, let me do this then. Okay, so that is that. And now let me just share it. This it's the okay. Do you have it now? Have you got it?
Yeah, you need to go to full screen on PowerPoint.
Yeah. I was trying
There we go.
Yeah, I was and now it's still full screen, right?
Yep.
I was trying to do it a special way where I can also see the chat and everything else. So hopefully I've managed to do that. So thank you again, first of all, to Dottie who extended the invitation, and to all of you for being here, especially on such a lovely evening in Chicago, which I know we all know is a summer pleasure. So thank you again for spending your evening with me. I know that we've got people here who read the book and other people who haven't. And so what I thought I'd do is just start off for about 5 minutes or so, introducing Last Call at the Hotel Imperial, showing you some pictures and maps, and then we'll move to Q&A and discussion. All of the themes and sort of ins and outs of the book will come through in that way. Last Call at the Hotel Imperial is a book about a group of friends and sometimes rivals who became some of the most celebrated American foreign correspondents of their day. So John Gunther, Dorothy Thompson, R Knickerbocker, and Vincent Sheean. Today, their names aren't at all well known, but in their day, they were celebrities on an international stage, as equally famous as their lost generation novel writing counterparts, F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway. Except that unlike Fitzgerald and Hemingway, they weren't running away from politics, but rather they were running towards the fire. So my book's about the rise of fascism, about the kinds of challenges that anti-colonial nationalists like Gandhi and Nehru posed to the tottering European empires, about a journalism of warning that broke the rules about objectivity and reporting, and about a moment when American foreign correspondents were the kings of the hill. At a time when appeasement and isolationism held sway, much of what Americans knew about the crack-up of the European democracies and the rise of the dictators owed to the work of people like the figures at the heart of Last Call. So I just wanted to start off by giving you a sense, first of all, we were talking about this just before it, as people were coming in, of their travels. So this is a map of their travels and I'll talk more about these 4 people in just a second and show you some pictures of them. But this gives you just a snapshot of the extraordinary terrain that they were covering, both within the European continent and then ranging more widely, especially to the Middle East in the 20s. And I was saying that putting these together, which was essentially sort of harvesting all of the data about their peregrinations, had made me feel quite exhausted when I was doing it. I could only begin to imagine what this was like at a time when all of these travels essentially are accomplished on trains, on the back of donkeys, occasionally in cars. By the time that we get to the next slide, which is their travels in 1938, you do at least have the airplane, although still most of this travel is done on trains. And as I said, occasionally by cars. So, as I said, the book is about fascism, anti-colonialism, about reporting, about how to report. And on a deeper level, though, the book is also about really my major theme, which is the relationship between inner lives and geopolitics from the 1920s to the 1940s. This was a period when authoritarianism and the 2 world wars breached the barrier between public and private spheres. And the foreign correspondents in Last Call put this phenomenon, this sense of the collapse between geopolitics and private lives, front and center. Confronting the dictators rising across Europe and Asia, they saw that the individual leader counted now for everything. These were the people fomenting the world crisis. So to report on a Hitler or a Mussolini or a Stalin then required probing these connections between the interior worlds of family life, sexuality, and marriage, and the outer worlds of politics and international relations. So what they were doing is putting together these 2 big stories, both the story of kind of geopolitics and then the story that they thought helped to explain the phenomenon of why these individuals were themselves such perverse characters, but also why people who were so obviously dominant and deceptive. So let me just introduce the journalists at the heart of the book so that those of you who haven't read the book will have a picture in mind of who we're going to be talking about. So first off, John Gunther. This is Gunther in 1936. He was an
Deborah, could you, your screen is abbreviated on my.
Okay. Is this now better?
Yes.
That's better. Yes.
Okay, good. And now if I move this over, does it abbreviate or is it okay?
No, it's good now.
Okay, great. Okay, John Gunther. Oops. Gunther in 1936, as I said, in that image. Okay, he was a handsome, tall, blonde Chicagoan. He was a graduate in 1922 of the University of Chicago, who got his start as a cub reporter at the Daily News, covering gangster shootouts and Rotary Club luncheons. He left Chicago in 1924 for Europe, and he spent the next 12 years in nearly constant travel. So Gunther was always shooting between Vienna, Damascus, Cairo, Jerusalem, and Berlin, just to name a few of his most frequent routes. The book that made his name was Inside Europe, which was published in 1936, just around the time that this picture was taken. It was a taboo-breaking look at the dictators that who were rising across the European continent. Between the mid-1930s and the 50s, the end of the 50s, Gunther had more US bestsellers than any author except for the romance novelist Daphne du Maurier. So in terms of his significance as a best-selling writer, immensely important. Okay, so that's Gunther. I showed you Gunther in 1936. Here is Gunther, as you would have seen him walking around Hyde Park in 1922. And Inside Europe on the left, this cover the question about this cover was whether it was the bomb or whether it was a balloon with the air going out of the European story. And the resonance was both. And then you can see in a revised edition on the right-hand side. Okay, the second figure in the book is R Knickerbocker. And I should say, as I said before, this is a group of people who are friends and rivals, and Knickerbocker was one of Gunther's closest friends. So Knickerbocker was red-haired, he was wiry, he shot out of Yoakum, Texas, snapping at facts like a terrier to win the Pulitzer Prize in 1931 for his reporting on Stalin's first 5-year plan. He interviewed everyone who was anyone, from Stalin's mother, whom he located in a hamlet in the Caucasus, to Hitler, to Mussolini, 4 times. So it was said that he was the only journalist whose dispatches Mussolini bothered to read all of the way through. And you can see here him interviewing Stalin's mother. These pictures are still full screen, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So Knickerbocker is the second figure. The third figure is another U of C man, Vincent Sheean, known as Jimmy. By the time that Jimmy Sheehan published his memoir, Personal History, in 1935, he was already well known for his reporting in the Moroccan Wars of the mid-1920s. And the question at the heart of Sheehan's memoir was, as he put it, how the individual person enmeshes with society, with a historical process of which he is a part. Personal History would set a generational template for the way to live an engaged life. Again, a huge bestseller, not just in the US, but also in Britain. And then, let me show you some pictures of Sheehan. This is Sheehan at the time the Personal History was published. And now the fourth figure, Dorothy Thompson. Dorothy Thompson was the first American woman to lead a major overseas news bureau, a distinction that she always disdained for its "see what the little darling has done now" attitude. By the late 1930s, she had an estimated audience of 8 to 10 million readers for her syndicated thrice weekly On the Record column, nearly 3/5 of which were devoted to the anti-Nazi crusade. So she's constantly beating the drumbeat of alarm. Her signature was an unabashedly emotional style. Critics quipped that she was the only woman in America to have her menopause in public and to make it pay, which was obviously intended as an insult. She took it as a kind of funny quip. As her friend Jimmy Sheehan liked to say, when FDR wanted to sway opinion, it was Dorothy whom he called. And the next image is of Thompson on the cover of Time magazine, which she was in 1939. June of 1939, Time magazine described her alongside Eleanor Roosevelt as the most influential woman in America. So these four reporters, together with John Gunther's wife, Frances, who herself was a sometimes foreign correspondent, are the main figures in my book, along with a number of other reporters, Bill Shire, Edward R. Murrow, and Emily Hahn, among many others, as the supporting players. So let me just say a couple of words about the argument before we sort of return just to the conversation. What distinguished, and actually I will stop sharing and just appear before you. So now it's stopped sharing, right? And it's just me. Is that right? You're not seeing the screen any longer, right?
No.
Okay, good. What distinguished their writing, I argue in the book, was a new style of reporting. Unlike the war correspondents of the past, this group really disdained the role of thrill-seeking eyewitness. What they discovered was that a standard litany of
on the couch, okay?
couldn't express. So just the facts of what was happening could not express how drastically the world was changing. That ideal of objectivity that governed their editors and also their elders had to yield, they argued, to a different and more personal form of reporting. They took their own feelings as a proxy for the readers. As Dorothy Thompson wrote in a column published in the summer of 1939, quote, "Do you feel as I do, a fantastic dreamlike quality?" She continued, "Something ominous, a sense of sickness, as though all the world and everybody in it and you and I were sick in our nerves and in our brains and in our hearts." So what I'm arguing is that 30 years before the new journalism of Gay Talese or Joan Didion, for instance, this group of writers pioneered the intimate, subjective voice in nonfiction. They turned the analysis that they had perfected in their reporting inward on themselves, their spouses, their friends, their children. And for that reason, from this circle came not just the first modern account of illness and death in John Gunther's Death Be Not Proud, about the death of his 17-year-old son, Johnny, from a brain tumor, but also the first no-holds-barred chronicle of a modern marriage. Jimmy Sheehan's 1963 Dorothy in Red, about his friends, Dorothy Thompson, her husband, second husband, the Nobel laureate Sinclair Lewis. So amidst a century that had claimed more than 70 million lives, or a half century that had claimed more than 70 million lives through war and genocide, what they were doing, I'm arguing, is making a really valid case for the word. So that's just an overview.
Deborah, could you repeat what you just said, because you muted out?
Oh yeah, of course.
Just the last sentence.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So what I'm arguing is that this group of reporters kind of take out of the experience of the 1930s a sense, really an exigent sense of the importance of the individual. And it's that which informs this kind of new nonfiction style, I'm arguing, that they pioneer. So thank you. That's just a very brief overview, but I figured that I would give you a sense of what the book is about, and then we can open up for questions, more discussion.
Well, I'm going to start just with a question. You, as I understand, you kind of discovered the idea for this book through some research you were doing at Special Collections at the Regenstein Library. So I'm curious what that research was and what were the one or two pieces where you started to see the bigger story?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, because now that I have finished this one and I'm looking forward to the next, it's, you know, how I'm curious for Pamela to talk about this as well, but how you move from one project to another is always seems like there's a little bit of divine intervention. But at any rate, I'd written a book about family secrets, so in Britain, and the Wall Street Journal had asked me to write a piece that was about, they do that 5 best column. So the 5 best books about parents and children, in my case, since I'd written this book about family secrets. And so I went back and reread a bunch of stuff that I had really loved on the subject. And one of the books was Gunther's Death Be Not Proud, which my mother had been assigned in 10th grade in Louisville, Kentucky, in her civics class. And so we always had that paperback. I'm curious actually to know how many of you had read it in high school, especially? I see.
I read
seven-
it. I read it. I picked it up in the library and I fell in love with it. It was incredible.
Yeah, people really had what Risley is describing. People really had that sort of emotional connection to the book. I mean, even more so, I think, than I realized when I went to read the Gunther papers. At any rate, what I thought I was going to do is write a piece maybe about mourning in the aftermath of the Second World War, because it struck me as so interesting that this book, published in 1949, had generated this huge correspondence. So I started looking at the correspondence, which is preserved in special collections, and we're talking about thousands of letters from grieving parents, for whom this book was incredibly important, from high schoolers who are writing to Gunther once it starts to become an assigned text. And so I was working away there for a while. And then I started just to call up other pieces of that collection. And the collection is incredible, 250 plus boxes. There's what you can see on the website is the sort of older donations, but there's a newer part of the archive that was donated in the 80s and 90s that actually isn't on the website. So the boxes, you wouldn't know that they were there. And after I'd been working there for a while, I can't remember who in special collections, but someone said, oh, well, you should look at the other stuff too. And I started to look in the miscellaneous correspondence. I mean, the named correspondence files were incredible. So Eleanor Roosevelt was in there, every European leader, every diplomat worth considering. And then I just pulled up some miscellaneous correspondence files, and there was a letter from Nehru, a never before known letter from a young Nehru at the beginning of his presidency of the Indian National Congress, writing to Gunther. And I thought, wow, this is, I have to write about these people. And I became really interested in the multi-vocality of the archive. I read a lot of letters of his friends, and the project just grew and grew and grew, where first of all, I was writing about Gunther and Francis Gunther, his wife, as I said, is that sometimes foreign correspondent. And then I thought, but then I have to write about their friends, because they were all sort of working out the problems, not just of the world, but also themselves in relationship to their friends. And so I started then to go to those archives, similarly voluminous. And then I ended up just chasing all over the world. Dottie had asked, so how do you go from, maybe the second archive I went to, I think, was Francis Gunther's archive, which is at the Schlesinger Library at the Radcliffe Institute. And then from there to Syracuse, where there was the Dorothy Thompson archive. And I ended up all over the place. As Ken Fuller can say, working on Sigrid Schultz, you're in the German archives, the Italian archives, the Spanish archives, wherever they went. Those were important places to figure out how they were being seen in India and so on. Does anyone else want to ask anything?
In your book, you go through a lot of detail about the interactions between the various people there and their relationship. Did you get that all from letters, that information?
Yeah, so there's a lot from letters. So they were avid correspondents, and in part because they were oftentimes apart from each other as friends. So both as, in terms of their spouses, but also their friends, you can see in those maps the places where the lines cross and they saw each other, but oftentimes they were actually corresponding and sharing impressions. So yes, there is a huge, huge, huge amount of correspondence. There's also a huge number of diaries. So, where Gunther, for instance, is writing about his impressions of R Knickerbocker when he first meets him, or he's writing about Knickerbocker's marriage, for instance. And then in addition to letters and diaries and reporters' notebooks and newspaper clipping files and interviews, so some interviews that were done with them in the 1960s and 1970s as people began to be interested in them as biographical subjects. Various people who had interviewed them lent me their interview notes so I could read those. And then many of these archives, in part because they're reporters, there were thousands and thousands of little slips of paper with thoughts written on them. And those were, I mean, daunting, first of all, because John Gunther's second wife, Jane Gunther, who's now died just in 2020, said, I don't know what you can make of these, but they struck me as being really important. And it would be things that he had written down before he went to bed or things he wanted to remember. And so there was that as well. But yeah, thank you. It's an important and a good question.
What sort of reaction have you had from Europe about the book?
So I think first of all, there's an interest in something that Europeans knew but had since forgotten, which is just how important and widely read this group of Americans were, and how much they were viewed as having set the mold on a new form of reporting.
Mhm.
So I think one of the things, so I began as a British and a European historian, so that's my training as a historian. And one of the things that I think to British historians was really, they were interested and surprised by, and this is also true of British journalists, is just how important this group of Americans was viewed as being. So someone like Harold Nicholson, who's a diplomat, himself a journalist, he essentially says when John Gunther's book comes out in 1936, that this is the kind of reporting that we in Britain need to emulate. And another envious British reporter, Malcolm Muggeridge, who really doesn't like them. He thinks they're really important, this group of people. But he doesn't like them. And he thinks that, they're giving themselves airs and graces. And Muggeridge says, these people are kind of fancied themselves as the knights, savior of the world. Or a British politician at the time, a Labour politician, says they are now the elder brothers to all the world, which is a really weird role reversal for Americans to be playing for the British. And similarly, in Austria, their names are well known. Knickerbocker stars in various French newsreels. Their articles are reprinted all over the European and Asian press as well. When John Gunther goes to Asia, he is a full-on international celebrity, interviewed by all of the papers. Chiang Kai-shek, who never sees anyone at that point, consents to grant him an interview. He presides over Nehru's first ever radio interview. First ever time Nehru actually appears on the radio. So really, really supersonically important there. We had a question in the chat that was about what role Freud played in their shift, and it is completely crucial. I mean, really, part of what I'm doing in the book is trying to map out a kind of everyday Freudianism and the ways in which that actually sort of lodges in people's consciousness and helps them to explain the phenomena that they're seeing in terms of the rise of authoritarianism in particular, but even the ways in which kind of psychodramas are playing out on the world stage. And so there's their own personal experience with psychoanalysis. So John Gunther is analyzed by Wilhelm Stekel, who is one of Freud's first apostates in Vienna. And that he's being analyzed even as in 1934 in Vienna, there's a civil war. The government is firing on socialist men, women, and children who are living in housing projects, with cannons. And then there's the murder of the Austrian dictator, Engelbert Dollfuss, by Austrian fascists. And John Gunther's analysis is playing out against this background. And so moving between, what made Hitler the man he is, or how did Mussolini's family life affect him, and his own psychoanalysis, and then trying to connect the two somehow is exactly what he's doing. So they're not uniform. I mean, this group of people have many arguments between them, among other things actually about Freud. So for someone like Sheehan, he doesn't think that Freud is actually all that helpful, and he is at some point committed to a Swiss institution kind of for a nervous breakdown. And he's analyzed by all these Freudians. And he's like, Freudianism, psychoanalysis is not a symptom, he says, of wisdom. It is a kind of madness in and of itself. That is what was Sheehan's opinion about psychoanalysis. But he had a kind of different sense of his own relationship to the world around him, which was that he believed that he could actually sense history in a bodily form. He thought, what Sheehan thought was that he could predict the future because the universe sent him messages about where to be. And all of his friends thought that that was incredibly bizarre and loony, except of course he was always on the spot. And then people started to think, well, he was there when he knew Gandhi was going to be assassinated, and he was there literally in the courtyard of Birla House when Gandhi was assassinated because he'd gotten this message from the globe, his lighted globe that he stared at. So they all had this sense of somehow living in history, and they were all reckoning with that in different ways. But Freudian analysis and psychoanalysis more broadly was a major, major way of doing that. Julia.
Thanks so much for your book. I'm early into it, but really enjoying it, so thank you. As you were retracing the steps of all of these journalists, what struck you as most surprising? Are there any specific examples that jump to mind?
It's such a good question. I think, let me say something that kind of reiterates what I've already said and then move to something different. The first thing that was really surprising to me was I thought, I was reading Frances Gunther's diary where she says, there's a passage where she is trying to work out, is John, her husband, like Hitler, or is she like Hitler in their marriage? And I remember reading that and thinking, it was 2015, and I thought, this is really crazy. This is just, whether it's psychoanalysis gone mad, she was also many times analyzed. But it seemed to me so over the top. And I remember I went to meet a friend and said, wow, I just read this really strange thing. But of course, in the next few years, what happened almost to everyone whom I knew was that they felt that they themselves were living some microcosm of the geopolitical situation in their own personal lives. And all of a sudden it started to seem not at all surprising, but in fact, exactly what would happen, right? As, these kind of epic figures take up more and more space in your brain, and they become both what you're analyzing, but also what you feel like you're living and the kind of analogies that you look to. I think the other thing that was surprising was, and a number of readers have also been surprised about this, which is the kind of autonomy and prerogatives that the women in the book seized. And Pam can probably talk to this about Sigrid Schultz, but there's a way in which foreign correspondence, in the new way that they're practicing it, is still a new field. And so it's up for grabs in a way. So someone like Frances Gunther becomes a foreign correspondent. She kind of declares herself a foreign correspondent, and then she sets off to the Soviet Union, and then she has pieces in the New York Times. So this first generation of women who are in the majority in the high schools, American women, not British women, interestingly, I can talk a little bit about the difference between them as foreign correspondents or the chances that they have. They are, almost have equal numbers in universities. in the early 1920s. And there are these career paths that open up for them. And of course, it's not perfect and they face incredible obstacles. But someone like Dorothy Thompson, in many ways, she writes her own ticket, not just because she's extraordinarily smart and hardworking and ferocious, but also because there's some space for her. And that was also, to actually see how that worked out within the context of people's lives and careers was really interesting to me.
Yeah, I
And we don't-
remember a passage about women could afford to fail.
Yes, 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 yes. And that's a beautiful, beautiful point and so if you're interested in that whole idea, if you haven't already read it, Lisa Cohen's book, All We Know, which is about it's about modernism and women in the 20s and 30s. It's a really, really gorgeous book. And what she's interested in is the whole question of failure. Like so what does it look like to be a woman and to fail in the 20s and 30s? Different because there's a prospect of succeeding. So, yeah. And what's really interesting, I'll just say one little pendant to this about the British, because I think it shows you how different the American situation was. For British women, reporters, incredibly difficult to break through. There's already a very solid tie between Fleet Street, the sort of newspaper center, and the government. The British women can only look at their American counterparts with complete envy. So.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Dottie, unmute.
So there's a
Dottie?
question in the chat. How did these American reporters interact and get along
Oh, yeah.
with foreign reporters?
Yeah. Really, it's a good question because there is, as I said, with the British, there's a lot of tension. So John Gunther, in particular, for some reason, I mean, he's much beloved by, British literary lions, but the kind of regular reporter is furious about the kinds of access that the Americans have. So the Americans in the Second World War are regularly seeing Churchill. They're invited to Chequers, to the Prime Minister's house for the weekend. Dorothy Thompson spends a weekend there with him. John Gunther has a long interview because Churchill recognizes how significant the Americans are actually to, the American reporters are to American public opinion. And so British reporters who barely, get a look in to their Prime Minister are really envious. The reporters who are running, the editors who are running the socialist papers, say in Vienna, are another interesting case in point. So they too view the Americans as the people who are going to continue their anti-fascist crusade, really, after the Austrian socialist newspapers, after the Austrian anti-fascist newspapers are shut down. And so Gunther is in constant contact with the editor of the Vienna workers' paper, the Arbeiterzeitung, who's constantly writing to him from exile. And Dorothy Thompson spends the entire late 1930s with a sheaf of applications, visa applications that she signed off on, trying to find people to sponsor in her handbag. So they're playing a really important role as a conduit between a kind of European newspaper world, especially a newspaper world that's coming under extraordinary pressure with all of these newspapers being shut down as authoritarians take power, and the American newspaper market, which is expanding. They have very fractious relationships as well, I should say, with Goebbels and with everyone who's trying to control the press. So Count Ciano who's Mussolini's son-in-law, and the Italian press officer. Everyone is trying to kind of get on the good side of the Americans, and they recognize these people as being important, conduits.
I'm interested in the fact that many of the people they interviewed particularly the fascists and the communists like Trotsky, Mussolini, Goebbels, and then on the other side, Churchill, had been reporters. And so they were thinking that they knew the tricks of the trade.
It is
And then on the other hand, the reporters could see that maybe they could have some more power like these people they were interviewing.
Yes, that was one, I mean, that comes back to Julie's question too, which was somehow recognizing. So I remember that moment, and I wasn't in the archives, I was actually writing, where I thought, oh, they're the double of each other. And because it's something that you don't think about, which is that it's easy to see these journalists, especially in this kind of what's known as this heroic period of foreign correspondence, as crusaders on behalf of liberty and individual and truth. But of course, they see themselves as, in some ways, trying to gain power, and not just power in the media landscape, but actually political, important power as actors in the political realm. And, you know, they're not really, at some point, they're superstars, they're worldwide celebrities, they're not really content with being reporters anymore. They want to play a decisive role in, you know, shaping public opinion. So they become columnists like Dorothy Thompson does in the later 30s with these huge, huge audiences, or they become advocates as someone like Sheehan does. I mean, Dorothy Thompson is an advocate as well, but, you know, Sheehan is a very good example because he stands for a set of values, and that is everything that he writes about. But yeah, there are these beautiful kind of set pieces of where they write about their interviews, and you can tell that, you know, if Knickerbocker goes to see Mussolini, he and Mussolini are busy charming each other because Mussolini wants to get out of Knickerbocker the latest news out of the German chancelleries or other European, you know, diplomats whom Knickerbocker knows. And Knickerbocker, of course, wants to get some kind of inner glimpse into what is motivating Mussolini and what Mussolini really thinks about this, that, or the other thing, which he knows he can't publish, but he can always use it because information is like currency, right? You can take it from chancellery to chancellery to chancellery and kind of peddle it for better access. So yeah, Carol, exactly what you say, that dynamic was really fascinating to me. And not something I expected actually going in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about when John and Jimmy Sheehan go to Damascus?
Yes, yes, yes.
That's a really gripping time in history.
Yeah, so in 1929, Sheehan is in Jerusalem. And as it happens, he's there at the start of the 1929 conflagration at the Western Wall. And so the conflict between that sparked up at the Western Wall, where there's a series of Arab riots, sort of what are later viewed, although it's an incredibly contentious subject, as Jewish provocations at the wall, especially by revisionist Zionists. Again, this is all, to some extent, these are still, you know, disputed subjects. But Sheehan is there, and he is the very first reporter who is actually getting the word out about what he sees. And he goes to Jerusalem, actually sent by a Zionist paper, and he's very sympathetic at first to the Zionist cause. And then he's there, and then he changes his mind and decides, in fact, that Zionism is an imperialism like any other imperialism. He is incredibly anti-imperial himself. And he also views the British as being essentially behind this entire mess, trying to use the tensions between Jews and Arabs to cement their own rule. And then John Gunther appears because he's been sent by the Chicago Daily News. He's the guy who's closest to Palestine. So he's been sent over, to get there as quickly as he can to report. And Gunther is a little bit less impolitic than Sheehan, but he essentially comes to the same conclusion. And then what Dottie's referring to is then they head off and they go to Armageddon to see the Oriental Institute sponsored dig there. They don't ever say anything about the University of Chicago, which is kind of funny. The two U of C boys there at the OI dig, but they don't say anything about that part of it in particular. They're more just there as tourists, and they're also there as to kind of get away from Jerusalem, which both of them find to be an incredibly anxiety producing, because obviously there's sort of shooting in the streets, but also really depressing place to be, because what both of them see is that this conflict is now going to become intractable. So in 1929, they're already writing and saying, there's going to be no way out here.
Wow.
And, it's prescient, and also it makes sense in terms of their own, political stance. And I would say another thing, which is that they're very accustomed by that point. By 1929, they've spent a lot of time in East Central Europe. They've dealt with nationalities problems, and they sort of understand how nationalisms work and how complicated they are.
Can you talk a little bit about the Hotel Imperial and why you chose it as the title of your book and the importance of it to this?
So it's a couple of different things. So first of all, the Hotel Imperial was one of the reporters' hangout places in Vienna. It was the kind of place where all sorts of people met, the kind of Montenegrin gun smugglers and the turpentine merchants and the flax brokers and the diamond merchants, and then the reporters. And so what people said was that there was an aroma of conspiracy about the place. It was then and is now still one of the fanciest hotels in Vienna, right on the Ringstrasse. So people are coming in and going. It was the place to go and get good tips on the latest intrigues, in whatever, in the various courts of Europe that still existed, political gossip, that kind of thing. And it tended to be a place where you went in the morning. They had another late evening hangout, the Café Louvre. But the second sense in which the book is entitled Last Call at the Hotel Imperial is that because the Hotel Imperial, after the Nazi Anschluss, so after the German tanks roll into Vienna, the Hotel Imperial is the first place that Hitler goes. Because as a young man, the house painter, the failed artist, he's shoveling snow outside of the Hotel Imperial. And in the sort of cry of the excluded, he feels like, the fancy people who are coming in to go to their balls there and all dressed to the nines don't pay any attention to the downtrodden and the impoverished who are outside of the hotel freezing. And so Hitler he doesn't go to the Chancellery, he goes to the Hotel Imperial, and he sets up court at the Hotel Imperial. And that's where anyone who wants to come and pay tribute to Hitler or to the regime drops flowers at the Hotel Imperial. So people viewed the Hotel Imperial in a sense as the sort of heart of the Viennese system. And in a way, Vienna is also the heart of my book too, because it's there that for everyone, for all the figures I'm talking about, that in 1934, that they really see the writing on the wall. Not just that about the rise of fascism, but also that a world war is now going to be inevitable, and the deck has now been stacked in favor of fascism and against socialism. So, as fascism, communism, and democracy are battling it out in the 1920s and 30s, Vienna is the place. Again, I guess maybe back to Julie's question about what was surprising. I had been teaching European history for 30 years. but I don't think I had that perspective, right? We tend to tell our stories about Germany, or Britain, France, and the kind of sad story of the Austrian Republic isn't the first place that, that I don't even know that in my modern European history lectures, I had much about Austria other than the Anschluss. But for this group of people, 1934 in Vienna is absolutely crucial.
Why is it so crucial?
So in 1934 in Vienna, so let me just back up and say, so, the First World War sweeps away 4 empires. So the Austro-Hungarian, the German, the Russian, and the Ottoman. And in a way, we think about all of those a lot more probably than the kind of Habsburg story. But as the Habsburg Empire falls apart, what's left in its place, what Vienna, which is once the head of this huge empire, then becomes the kind of imperial capital for an empire that doesn't exist anymore. And so if you think about today's politics of urban versus countryside, that's pretty much what's happening in the Austrian Republic in the 20s and 30s, which is that there's 2 million people in Vienna. It's a red city. It's a socialist city. Outside in the countryside, there are 4 million people, just about 4 million people, very, very, very conservative, who want no part of the socialism that is being tried in Vienna. And so what happens, there's great instability in terms of the government. There are revolutions, there are coup attempts, there are attempted revolutions. All of these things, these American reporters are witnessing, because more or less all of them are at some point stationed in Vienna or passing through Vienna for some extended period of time. But the culmination of all of this is in 1934, the Austrian dictator, who has kind of followed along the route of declaring the parliamentary government is finished in 1933. He says, no more parliament. This is now over. In 1934, in February of 1934, there's a civil war in Austria that pits the government and all of its kind of radicalized right-wing supporters in the countryside against the socialists, the workers of the city. And the government forces in February of 1934 essentially start to attack the socialist housing projects to try to decapitate, quite literally, the power of socialism in Vienna and the power of Vienna within this kind of rump Austrian Republic. So that happens in February of 1934. Now, everyone who's sitting there in February knows that what has just happened is Dollfuss, the Austrian dictator, has just made it possible for Nazism to gain power. So Dollfuss is a dictator, but he's not a Nazi. He's what he refers to as an Austro-fascist, meaning he has his own idea about what kind of government is best. And he is an avid opponent of Hitler. He doesn't want National Socialism. Dollfuss does not want National Socialism in Austria. But by removing some of the enemies of National Socialism, he makes the accession of Austrian Nazism much more likely. And sure enough, what happens that summer, he is murdered. He's assassinated by a group of Austrian Nazis working in collaboration, it's presumed at the time, with German Nazis. And this is the first moment, and this is why it's so important to answer Rosalie's question, is the first moment that people can see the way that Nazism is mushrooming beyond Germany's borders. It now looks like the kind of dominoes of, what used to be republics are all going to fall. I see it, that I think Marilyn has a hand up. Is that right? No, maybe not.
In the 1930s, these reporters were reporting a lot on communism and fascism, which was a big deal, and the tensions in the country. What could you comment on their reaction when Russia and Germany had the non-aggression pact, and reporters found out about that?
Yeah, it's a really important point, and I'm just going to take one step back and say, so what happens essentially to this group of American reporters is that they become arbiters on this big contest that is happening in a world. It's a worldwide contest between democracy on the one hand as an ideal, set of ideals, communism, Soviet communism on the other, and then fascism. And, with socialism as a kind of in there somewhere, but not quite as important. And each of these world systems is trying to, in a way, compete for public opinion. I mean, it's a strange thing to think about now, but, the Soviets, of course, have propaganda campaigns directed at the US in particular, and at all the Western nations to say, look at you, you're mired in the Depression. We, meanwhile, are building magnificent steel mills. So what happens is that these reporters, again, they have various political differences. Dorothy Thompson and R Knickerbocker are avidly anti-communist. And Knickerbocker, very, very early on, reports on the famine in Ukraine. He says millions of people have died. He hates the Soviet system. Jimmy Sheehan, meanwhile, is very sympathetic to it. So they're friends, as I said, they're rivals, and they're antagonists, actually, ideological antagonists at various points. So Sheehan, who's most sympathetic, along with Francis Gunther, to Soviet communism, is utterly disenchanted when news of the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact, news of the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact is revealed, and then further the kind of carving up that is contemplated is also revealed in 1939. And Sheehan, who has been really one of the best known American exponents of kind of popular frontism, of the whole idea of the kind of romance of the Soviet system, then turns sharply against it and writes a series of articles essentially saying, I was wrong about Soviet communism. And now I feel ashamed that I didn't say more about the murder of all of these people in the name of industrialization. And that this is just another kind of tyranny. It's nothing more. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
But you can see just from that little description how much, within them, there's so, on the one hand, they cling to each other because they're oftentimes out there by themselves, and but they have a lot of disagreements and a lot of really ferocious arguments. Knickerbocker and Gunther, who are very close, pretty much come to blows in the late at one night when Gunther accuses Knickerbocker of being basically little more than a journalist whore who is, selling his services to get interviews, by which he means writing flattering things about the leaders who give him interviews.
Okay, any other questions? Well, I want to thank you, Deborah, for being with us tonight. This was fascinating, and it was terrific to have you drill down on all the University of Chicago related details for us too, because that you're discovering the idea of special collections is fascinating to learn. It's the backstory to your book.
And there's a lot more in the book about various, they're sort of kind of disreputable, in some cases, passage through the University of Chicago. So yeah, if you're interested in the University of Chicago, there's a lot there. Thank you so much to you all.
Terrific.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much again for the questions, and I really appreciated the chance to get a chance to talk to you all. So thank you. Have a
Thank you.
good evening.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Take care
Really
again.
great.
Thank
Night,
you.
everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. That's it.